The air in the courtroom felt heavier than it should have, thick with judgment and the faint scent of old wood polish. I sat there, clutching the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. My name was Claire Turner, and that day I was fighting for the one thing that still made my life worth living, my daughter Lila. She was only 3 years old, soft curls and dimpled cheeks, her laugh like sunlight breaking through clouds. And yet here I was, in a courtroom where even sunlight seemed unwelcome. My own mother, Patricia Turner, a woman of pressed collars and practiced smiles, sat calmly in the witness box, looking every inch the dignified grandmother. Her voice, measured and unwavering, filled the room as she told the court that I was unstable. "She can barely hold a job," she said. "My daughter is irresponsible, emotionally unfit, and cannot provide a stable environment for a child." She didn't even glance my way. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, flickering faintly as if protesting the lies that floated beneath them. My throat tightened. The judge, Harold Morrison, watched with the detached interest of a man who'd seen too many families crumble. My attorney, Sarah Chen, shifted nervously beside me, her pen tapping lightly against a yellow legal pad. She was kind but overworked, one of those public defenders assigned to hopeless cases, and I was starting to think that's exactly what I had become. The courtroom silence was interrupted only by the rustle of papers and the steady, calm voice of Franklin Howard, my mother's attorney. He was the kind of lawyer who wore $1,000 suits and smiled like he already knew the ending. "Mrs. Turner," he said gently, "I know this must be painful. But please, for the record, can you tell the court about your daughter's employment history?" Patricia straightened, her pearl earrings glinting under the harsh light. "Claire was terminated from her position at Weston Birch Law Firm 16 months ago," she said smoothly. "Since then, she's worked at several places, none of them for long. A cafe, a retail store, a few odd jobs here and there. She lacks consistency." My hands clenched beneath the table. It wasn't the full truth. I had left the cafe because they demanded night shifts that clashed with my visitation schedule for Lila. The retail store closed due to bankruptcy, not because I failed, but truth didn't matter here. Perception did, and Patricia was a master of it. Howard smiled, his voice full of mock sympathy. "So, it's fair to say your daughter struggles to maintain steady employment?" Patricia hesitated just long enough to make the pause seem thoughtful. "I'm afraid that's accurate." The words hit me like a hammer. Accurate. My mother had always known exactly how to wound without raising her voice. I could feel the room's silent judgment pressing against my skin. The bailiff's glance, the clerk's frown, even the court reporter's subtle pause as if pitying me. Sarah scribbled something on her notepad, but she didn't look up. Howard wasn't done. He flipped through his folder, pulling out another document. "Mrs. Turner, are you aware of an incident 7 months ago involving your granddaughter?" Patricia's expression shifted into one of carefully curated concern. "Yes. Claire was supposed to pick up Lila from preschool at 5:30. She never showed up. The school called me at 6:15. Lila was crying in the office asking for her mother. The judge's gaze shifted toward me, sharp and assessing. My stomach dropped. "It was one time," I whispered under my breath. My car had blown a tire on the interstate, and my phone battery had died. I had run to a gas station, used their payphone to call, but by then, the school had already reached my mother. I wasn't late because I didn't care. I was late because life had cornered me, and I was running on fumes. But Howard made it sound like a crime. "And when you arrived, Mrs. Turner, did your daughter seem apologetic?" "She seemed frazzled," Patricia replied delicately. "But it's not about apologies, Mr. Howard. It's about responsibility. Lila deserves stability. My daughter, she tries, but she's simply not capable." That was Patricia's favorite word, capable. She had used it all my life. When I failed to make the honor roll, "Claire, you're capable of better." When I didn't make varsity, "You're capable but not disciplined." When my marriage collapsed, "You're capable of choosing better." Now she was using it to erase me. Howard smiled. "No further questions, Your Honor." My heart was hammering by the time he sat down. Every breath felt heavier. Sarah leaned toward me. "We'll get our turn," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. When I took the stand, the room felt smaller. My legs trembled as I raised my hand, swearing to tell the truth. I wanted to believe truth still mattered. Howard stood again, pen in hand. "Ms. Turner, he began. You were dismissed from Weston Birch Law Firm, correct? Yes, I said. And why was that? I was dealing with postpartum depression, I replied. I was going through a divorce, raising a newborn alone. I made mistakes, but none that harmed a client. 2 missed deadlines, Howard pressed. In the legal profession, deadlines are sacred. Would you call that responsible? I swallowed hard. I was sick. I was trying. Just answer the question, Ms. Turner. Would you call that responsible? No, I said softly. The word felt like surrender. He smiled faintly. Thank you. Now, what is your current occupation? I work at Brookside Cafe. As what? A barista. And how much do you make? $12 an hour, plus tips. Howard's eyebrows lifted, his voice almost pitying. And how many hours per week? 25 to 30. So roughly $350 a week, before taxes. He turned toward the judge. Your Honor, with all due respect, that's barely enough to support one person, let alone a child. He turned back to me. Where do you live? In a studio apartment. How large? About 400 square feet. And where would your daughter sleep? I have a toddler bed in the corner, I said quietly. In the corner of a studio, Howard repeated, his tone dripping with judgment. While your mother owns a 3-bedroom home in a safe neighborhood with a yard and a playroom. Tell me, Ms. Turner, which seems more stable to you? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Howard smiled faintly. No further questions. When I stepped down, I felt hollow, like my bones had been replaced with sand. Sarah tried to reassure me, whispering that the judge would see my sincerity, that being honest mattered. But in family court, honesty isn't the currency that wins. Stability is, and I had none to offer. When Judge Morrison called a recess, I stumbled into the hallway, the world spinning around me. I pressed my back to the cold marble wall and tried not to cry. Sarah approached gently. Claire, she said softly, you need to prepare yourself. Your mother's case is strong. The court favors consistency and financial security. I shook my head. She can't take Lila. She can't. Sarah's eyes softened. We'll do everything we can. But the way she said it felt like an apology, not a promise. 15 minutes later, the bailiff called us back in. I walked into the courtroom like someone walking into their own funeral. Patricia sat tall and composed, Franklin Howard calm and smug beside her. I could see my entire life collapsing in the judge's steady gaze, and then the door opened. A tall man in a navy suit entered, his silver hair gleaming under the lights. He walked straight toward our table with quiet authority. Your Honor, he said, his voice deep and calm. Apologies for the delay. My name is Marcus Kane. I've just been retained to represent Ms. Claire Turner. Everyone turned to stare. Even my mother's perfect composure cracked. Marcus set his briefcase on the table and looked at me with steady eyes. Don't worry, he said softly. You're not losing your daughter today. And for the first time in months, I felt something I had forgotten existed. Hope. The room stilled. For a moment, all I could hear was the rhythmic tick of the courtroom clock and the rustling of papers as everyone tried to process what had just happened. Judge Morrison adjusted his glasses, frowning as he scanned the documents the bailiff handed him. Mr. Kane, he said at last, his tone formal but intrigued. You're aware this proceeding is already well underway? Marcus Kane nodded, calm and unbothered. Yes, Your Honor. I was retained this morning under emergency counsel authority. I apologize for my late arrival. There was an issue with my flight from Seattle. But I believe my client's right to fair representation outweighs any inconvenience. Howard was on his feet before the judge could respond. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We're at the conclusion of testimony. The petitioner rests. This is frankly grandstanding. Marcus smiled, slow and razor-sharp, like a man used to dismantling opponents who underestimated him. I'm aware of how it looks, Mr. Howard, but irregular isn't illegal. My client deserves to be fully represented before a ruling is made. And I have evidence and witnesses that have yet to be considered. Evidence that may significantly alter this court's perception of both parties. Judge Morrison's brow furrowed. He was the kind of man who didn't like surprises in his courtroom. You're telling me you have new testimony? I do, Your Honor, Marcus replied, voice measured and calm, including witnesses relevant to the fitness of the petitioner, Mrs. Patricia Turner. With the court's permission, I'd like to recall Mrs. Turner to the stand and introduce an additional witness who has just arrived. The judge studied him, then turned to my mother. Mrs. Turner, please return to the witness stand. For the first time that day, my mother hesitated. It was subtle, a pause just long enough to reveal uncertainty. But I noticed it. She adjusted her blazer, lifted her chin, and walked back to the stand with the grace of a woman who believed poise could protect her from truth. Marcus Kane opened his briefcase, carefully selecting a single folder. His movements were precise, deliberate, every gesture calculated to draw attention without wasting a word. When he finally spoke, his tone was polite, but edged with something sharp. Says, Turner, he began, you've testified at length about your daughter's instability and irresponsibility. You've also portrayed yourself as the model of financial and emotional stability, correct? My mother clasped her hands. Yes, everything I've done is for my granddaughter's welfare. Of course, Marcus said with a slight nod. And you'd consider yourself honest with this court? Absolutely. Marcus smiled faintly. Then let's talk about honesty. He picked up a document and walked toward the witness stand. Do you recognize this? Patricia blinked, leaning forward. It looks like a bank statement. It is, Marcus confirmed. Your bank statement, to be exact. Specifically the joint account under your name and a Mr. Edward Leland. A flicker of panic flashed in her eyes, small but unmistakable. Howard immediately objected. Your Honor, relevance? Marcus didn't miss a beat. It goes to credibility, Your Honor. The petitioner has testified she is financially stable and capable of providing long-term care for a minor. However, these documents indicate she has been concealing significant financial debts. The judge motioned for him to continue. Proceed, but make it quick, Mr. Kane. Marcus flipped the page. Over the last 2 years, Mrs. Turner, you withdrew $72,000 from this account, funds marked as investment transfers. Yet your declared income doesn't support that. Would you like to explain? My mother's composure faltered. Those were private transactions, she said tightly. Edward is a friend. It's irrelevant to this case. Private, Marcus repeated slowly. Yet you listed this same friend as a co-signer on a $90,000 personal loan 3 months ago. And according to these records, you're currently in default. The courtroom murmured again. Marcus's voice remained calm, almost gentle. So when you told the court that your financial situation was stable, that was untrue. Patricia's hands tightened on the edge of the witness box. I didn't think it was relevant. My debts don't affect my ability to care for Lila. Marcus tilted his head. You don't think a person in financial default is relevant when petitioning for custody of a child? Objection, Howard barked. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge said. Mr. Kane, mind your phrasing. Marcus nodded, backing off slightly. Of course. Then let's move on. He picked up another paper, this time with a small smirk. Mrs. Turner, do you recall an incident last summer involving a restraining order filed by your neighbor, Mrs. Cole? My stomach twisted. And damaged her garden fence, threatened her with legal action, and entered her property without consent, Marcus interjected smoothly. The restraining order was granted and upheld for 6 months, correct? She's exaggerating, my mother snapped. Marcus raised a brow. You filed an appeal, which the county court denied. So, Mrs. Turner, would you say this is also a misunderstanding? Patricia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus let it sit, just long enough for the damage to sink in. Then he turned to the judge, voice even. Your Honor, we now have evidence of financial instability and an active legal record suggesting issues with anger and boundary control. I'd argue this contradicts the petitioner's portrayal as a calm, responsible caretaker. Howard was on his feet again. This is a smear campaign. Marcus turned, his tone icy but polite. It's called the truth, Mr. Howard. You should try it sometime. The gallery let out a faint chuckle before the judge's gavel silenced the room. Marcus wasn't finished. I'd like to call one more witness, Your Honor. The judge sighed. Who? Marcus glanced toward the courtroom doors. Mr. Tom Peterson. I froze. My old manager from the cafe. He stepped inside, looking uneasy but determined. Howard scoffed. We've already heard from Mr. Peterson during petitioner's presentation. Correct, Marcus said. But that testimony was elicited under selective questioning. I'd like the court to hear the rest. Peterson took the stand, glancing between Marcus and me. Peterson, Marcus began, you previously testified that Ms. Turner was late for work several times and seemed distracted. Do you stand by that? Yes, but, Marcus prompted. But she also worked double shifts when we were short-staffed. Honestly, I admired her for showing up at all. Howard objected weakly, but even the judge didn't seem interested in stopping this one. Marcus smiled faintly. Mr. Peterson, would you consider Ms. Turner irresponsible? Not even close, Peterson said firmly. She's the kind of person who blames herself for things that aren't her fault. The words hit me like a quiet mercy. Marcus turned back to the judge. No further questions. For the first time since the trial began, the air in the courtroom shifted. The judgmental glances softened. And my mother, she sat stiffly in her seat, color drained from her face. Marcus returned to our table, leaned slightly toward me and whispered, Do you trust me? I nodded, my throat tight. Good, he said softly. Because I'm about to finish this. He stood again, walking to the center of the room with a confidence that silenced even Howard. Your Honor, he said, voice clear. We've heard plenty today about perceived instability, but what we haven't heard is intent. Who truly acts in Lila Turner's best interest? He turned slightly toward me, then back to the bench. My client lost everything, career, marriage, home. Yet she never stopped fighting for her daughter. She didn't abandon her. She didn't hand her off for convenience. She showed up. Every visitation, every hearing, every job. That's not instability, Your Honor. That's resilience. The judge said nothing, but his expression softened. Marcus continued, tone now low, deliberate. Meanwhile, the petitioner has misrepresented her finances, concealed debt, and engaged in behavior inconsistent with the stability she preaches. I'll submit the evidence shortly. But more than that, I asked the court to see beyond titles and income. Because if love and endurance counted for currency, my client would be the wealthiest person in this room. He paused. That's all, Your Honor. Silence filled the courtroom again, heavier this time, but not oppressive, hopeful. For the first time since this nightmare began, I lifted my head and met my mother's gaze. The calm superiority she had worn like armor was gone. What I saw instead was fear. And deep down, I knew Marcus Kane hadn't just defended me. He had changed the tide. When the courtroom adjourned for a brief recess, the tension didn't leave the air, it thickened. Conversations broke out in murmurs behind me, like whispers swirling in a storm. I sat frozen, my fingers digging into the wood of the defense table, unable to decide if what had just happened was real or some fragile dream that would vanish the moment I blinked. Marcus Kane stood a few feet away, head slightly bowed as he organized his files, his composure unshaken. The man was impossible to read, sharp and controlled, yet there was something in the way he glanced toward me, a quiet assurance that told me this wasn't over. He wasn't done. My mother, Patricia Turner, sat rigid at her table, lips pursed tight, one manicured hand gripping a tissue that she hadn't once used to wipe her eyes. Her mask of dignity was beginning to crack. Howard leaned close to her, whispering in hurried tones, but Patricia's expression didn't change. She stared ahead, eyes glassy, like a statue built on arrogance and fear. When the bailiff announced that the court was back in session, I took a deep breath, forcing my trembling legs to stand. Marcus placed a hand gently on my shoulder as I moved back to my seat. Stay calm, he murmured, his tone steady, commanding. What happens next, you'll remember for the rest of your life. The gavel struck once. I'd like to recall one more witness before closing statements. Howard groaned audibly. Your Honor, this has gone far beyond the reasonable scope of... Overruled, Morrison said curtly. Let's hear it. Marcus gave a single nod. Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to call Dr. Eleanor Briggs to the stand. A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. The name meant nothing to me at first, until a woman in her early 40s stood up from the back row and walked toward the witness box. Her presence was calm but confident, her short auburn hair tucked neatly behind her ears. She wore a navy blazer and carried a stack of documents in her hands. She looked familiar. Then it hit me. Dr. Briggs, my old therapist. The one I had seen for 6 months after Derek's death, when I could barely sleep, barely breathe, when postpartum depression had left me staring at walls, feeling like I was fading. Marcus approached her with a respectful nod. Dr. Briggs, could you please state your full name and credentials for the record? Of course, she said. Dr. Eleanor Briggs. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist with the Oregon State Board of Psychology. I specialize in trauma and postpartum mental health. And you've worked with Ms. Claire Turner before, correct? Yes, she replied. Ms. Turner was my patient for 6 months, approximately 2 years ago. Howard was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Patient-doctor privilege. She has given consent, Marcus said, cutting in smoothly. Signed this morning. Howard faltered, his mouth opening, then closing. Marcus gestured for her to continue. Dr. Briggs, based on your sessions with my client, would you describe her as emotionally unstable? Dr. Briggs gave a small smile, the kind reserved for people who know how ridiculous that question truly is. No, she said firmly. Quite the opposite. Ms. Turner came to therapy seeking help, and she did the work. She attended every session, completed every exercise. She was experiencing grief and depression, which were situational and directly tied to the trauma of her divorce and subsequent job loss, not indicative of chronic mental instability. Marcus nodded. Did you ever have cause to believe Miss Turner posed any risk to her child? Absolutely not, Dr. Briggs said. She spoke about her daughter constantly. Her entire motivation for recovery centered around being a better mother. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that her love for Lila was her primary anchor. The courtroom was dead silent. Patricia's knuckles whitened around her tissue. She exhibits the resilience, empathy, and self-awareness essential to healthy parenting. She's faced more hardship than most people could handle, and she's come out stronger. Marcus gave a faint nod of gratitude, then turned toward the bench. No further questions. Howard rose for cross-examination, but his usual sharpness was gone. Dr. Briggs, he said, you only treated Ms. Turner 2 years ago. Isn't it possible her mental state has changed since then? Dr. Briggs looked unimpressed. It's possible for anyone's mental state to change, Mr. Howard, including yours. A few quiet laughs rippled through the room. Even Judge Morrison's lips twitched. Howard's face flushed. No further questions. Marcus smiled faintly and returned to the defense table. He placed his hands flat on the surface and looked at me for a long moment. Then he turned toward the judge. Your Honor, he said softly, before I rest, I'd like to read something into the record. He opened a folder, pulling out a worn, folded piece of paper. He glanced at me again before continuing. This was written by Ms. Turner last year as part of her therapy process. Even Howard looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I felt tears sting my vision, not from shame this time, but from something that felt dangerously close to hope. Marcus closed the file, his voice softer now. Your Honor, that's who my client is. Not the caricature painted by her mother, not the broken woman the opposing counsel describes, but a survivor, a mother, and the only person in this room who has fought for Lila out of love, not pride. He turned and faced Patricia directly. Because sometimes, Your Honor, love isn't tidy. It's not built on perfect resumes or clean records. It's built on sacrifice, on staying, on refusing to let go. Then he walked back to our table, sat down, and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, Now, we wait. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He looked down at the files before him, then at the woman on the witness stand, who now looked nothing like the self-assured grandmother from an hour ago. Patricia's face had drained of all color, her lips pale, her eyes darting nervously between Howard and the judge. Finally, Morrison spoke. I've heard enough. The gavel didn't fall yet, but the sound of his voice was final enough to make everyone still. This case was presented as a question of stability versus instability, he said. But what I've witnessed today is something else entirely, a question of honesty. I've reviewed the petitioner's testimony and the newly submitted evidence. It's clear to this court that Mrs. Turner omitted crucial information and misrepresented her own financial and behavioral record. Patricia's face twisted. Your Honor, Do not interrupt me, Mrs. Turner, Morrison snapped. This is my courtroom. Her mouth snapped shut. He continued. Meanwhile, Ms. Turner's struggles, her depression, her financial hardship, were never acts of negligence. They were acts of endurance. And endurance is often what separates a capable parent from an incapable one. The words hit me like sunlight breaking through clouds. The judge set his pen down. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that full legal and physical custody of minor Lila Turner be granted to her mother, Ms. Claire Turner. Supervised visitation rights for the petitioner, Mrs. Patricia Turner, are to be limited pending further review. It took a moment for the words to sink in. I blinked once, twice. Then it hit me. I had won. I didn't hear the gasps from the gallery or Howard's muttered curse. All I heard was the thunder of my heartbeat and the faint sound of my own shaky breathing. My hands flew to my mouth as tears spilled down my cheeks, tears of relief, disbelief, release. Across the aisle, my mother sat motionless, her body stiff as if frozen mid-breath. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. For the first time in my life, Patricia Turner looked small. Marcus stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and looked at the judge. Thank you, Your Honor. Morrison gave a curt nod. We're adjourned. The gavel struck, echoing like a heartbeat through the courtroom. When it was over, I found myself standing in the hallway, unable to move. The marble floor gleamed beneath the afternoon light streaming in through the high windows. I felt weightless, like the gravity that had crushed me for months had suddenly let go. Marcus stepped beside me, his presence steady and quiet. You did good in there, he said. I didn't do anything, I whispered. You did. He smiled faintly. You showed up. That's more than most people do when the world falls apart. I studied him for a moment. Why did you take my case? You don't even know me. His expression softened. Let's just say someone owed your old boss, Mr. Morgan, a favor, he said, almost teasing. He called me this morning. Told me you were about to lose something you shouldn't. I don't like watching good people lose. Before I could thank him, my phone buzzed. I looked down, and my heart twisted. A text from my mother. You've made a terrible mistake, Claire. You'll regret this. I stared at the message for a long time before locking the screen. Marcus glanced over. You okay? I nodded slowly. Yeah, for the first time in a long time. He smiled. Then go home. Your daughter's waiting. That evening, I drove through the rain to my apartment. The city lights shimmered in the puddles along the road. My little studio, once a symbol of failure, now felt like something else, a place I had earned. When I opened the door, Lila ran to me, her little arms wrapping around my legs. Mommy, she squealed. I dropped to my knees.